Good afternoon, Tom.
Good afternoon.
It is a very great privilege to be sitting down with you today because, again, you are one of the count 'em on half of one hand senior statespeople and true luminaries in the field of bioethics and research ethics as a subset thereof. And
Thank you for the tribute. I'm not sure I deserve it.
It is very much deserved. And
I've just been around a long time.
Well, certainly quality. Quantity is the least of it. So I very much look forward to hearing your stories, and let's get started. And as someone who really is, again, one of our founding parents and who has just shaped this field in immeasurable ways, I'd like to hear a little bit about your founding, about your background, your upbringing, and the values.
Where would you like to start?
Well, you choose. Your parents, what were your early influences? Was there ever a moment that, not a moment that set you on a path to bioethics, but a moment where you started to shape a worldview that endured?
Yeah, I think there's very little question about it. I could go on forever about it, and I won't, but in my case, it's pretty clear. When I was a young man of about just before 15, right at the end of the 14 period, I became very close to two young Methodist ministers. They were associate ministers, so they didn't have their own church, right? So they were a little bit freer to deal with young people and spend time with young people like me. And I was very influenced with their commitment to what today we might call ethics, although I don't think I would have categorized it in that way at that time. And they led me, not by leading my hand, because a lot of the stuff I just took off on my own. For example, I got very interested in Mahatma Gandhi and did a lot of work, you might say, as a 14-year-old or an early 15-year-old you did. But I actually did. I read a ton of stuff on Mahatma Gandhi. And Gandhi, oddly enough, took me to South Africa and apartheid. And apartheid had, some people would think, very odd effect of making me realize that where I lived in Dallas, Texas, wasn't all that different in terms of the segregation of the races from what was going on in apartheid in South Africa. Now, some people would say, surely you want to put that on a continuum. Okay, you can make all kind of qualifications. But what I came to think is, this is crazy. This society that I live in which everything is segregated, people are demeaned daily after slavery was over 100 years ago, right? This has to change. And I set about thinking that once people got this message, this was in Dallas where this stuff really was not discussed. This was not Birmingham, this was not people opting for civil rights in other locations. That people would sort of wake up and realize this would be a good thing to do. And I'll save you a long story. What I discovered is it was very difficult to move either white people or African Americans or Mexican Americans. You really had a kind of tripartite society in Dallas. It was very difficult to move any of them to any kind of action that would make a change because they were all scared. That's what the bottom line was. And so I became involved with a group, a very small group in Dallas of people who would sit in at establishments. I'm now 16, right? And so we would sit in and we got some changes, but they were very minor little changes. There was never any Birmingham, no dramatic stuff, in part because I think Dallas City Council was too smart for this. They realized if they intervened or the police intervened or reporters were sent to the scene, it was all bad news for Dallas. So they really paid no attention to our citizens. The only people who cared were the merchants who were economically hurt, right? So this had a very indelible impression on me. And I think that to trace it out to what you're interested in, which is bioethics, it's probably the main reason why, unlike most philosophers coming out of philosophy graduate student at that time who could care less about what we think of today as applied ethics, I mean, it just really was not present. There were only a few of us in philosophy, like Richard Wasserstrom in California, who was also a product of the civil rights movement, Jim Rachels at NYU. You can almost name on the fingers of one hand the people who were interested in this kind of thing. But I was, from the point that I emerged out of graduate school of philosophy, but there's no doubt that this early civil rights interest and what I learned there, I think, was the stimulus.
You have clearly been educated at some of the finest institutions in the country and the world, and I'd like to hear a little bit about your college and post-college education and where that took you, and whether that too had any impact on the genesis of your interest in bioethics, or your already established interest in ethics and justice.
I think the answer to that is probably not going to go quite in the way in which you might anticipate. I was very interested in social questions and political questions coming out of the civil rights movement, but it took me a long time to come to ethics questions per se. I became very interested in philosophy in large part because I wanted answers to social, political, and ethical questions, but I got sucked deeply into the philosophy of the time, which was not very hospitable. Remember, this is pre-John Rawls publishing A Theory of Justice, right? Nobody is doing any kind of applied work, and virtually no political philosophy was actually looked down upon at the time. So I was basically working in metaphysics and epistemology, not in ethics and social and political philosophy. Very, very little of that until I graduated, and then I began to teach courses on my own at Georgetown because I was interested in it. But you didn't have any teachers. There were no models for you anywhere in American higher education in philosophy that you could go to.
So you graduate and you have your newly minted PhD, and right about that time you are hired by Georgetown, you have a position, and you get a joint appointment at the Kennedy Institute.
Yeah. What happens
soon
is
after its founding. So
what happens is I'm appointed to Georgetown in the history of philosophy. That was the field in which they appointed me for, with the specialty in 18th century philosophy. But I still have these interests that I mentioned to you. The very first course that I taught when I went to Georgetown was in something like liberty, justice, and violence, or something like that, because these terms were in because of the war at the time, the Vietnam War. Right? And I knew students were interested in it because people would come to Washington and they would, I don't know if you remember that period, but they would camp out on the Georgetown campus. And some of the public officials had actually tear gassed the campus. It was tear gassed the day I arrived at Georgetown. To be a faculty member there, so I figured students were really going to like this, which they did. Right? They really went for it. So this was really my entree to the teaching of applied ethics. I'd had no such class at all when I was a graduate student, and I think almost no philosophers were exposed to it, but I dreamed up this course. By the way, Jim Rachels was doing the same thing at NYU at the same time, but again, there were very few people in philosophy who were. So I start that out, and then I meet Leroy Walters. So Leroy and I had been students at Yale together in some of the same years, but I hadn't met him. We had not met. But we formed a fast friendship. This would have been probably in late 1971, early 1972, something like this. And then Leroy introduced me to Andre Helligers, who had founded the Kennedy Institute and hired Leroy because of Leroy's interest in religious ethics, which Andre was also very interested in. So Andre and I, as it turned out, both worked on Saturdays. We went to the office on Saturdays. So we took to having lunch together every Saturday. And so we talked about everything, but mostly about ethics stuff, whatever I knew, whatever he knew. And after a while, he said, Tom, I'm going to make you an offer. Don't feel that you have to take it, but here's the offer. How would you like to be senior professor, right? Right? Senior research scholar. So remember, I'm 2 years out of graduate school. At the Kennedy Institute of Ethics. I'll give you an office overlooking the Potomac River, and I'll give you the secretary. Right? This is pretty hard to turn down because virtually no one had that in a philosophy department in those days, right? So I took it. That was the beginnings of my association with, because I felt then I had to publish in bioethics, so I started reading up on all the things in bioethics that I wanted to publish on.
So those must have been heady days. It was the pantheon, and still is. And I'd love you to choose a snapshot or two. What were the lunch table discussions like in 73, 74, 75? What were the staff meetings like? What was the landscape like at the Kennedy Institute soon after its founding when you arrived?
Well, there weren't any philosophers because Andre had founded the Institute with the organizational principle that religious ethics would be central. He wanted to have Muslim scholars, Jewish scholars, Protestant scholars, and Catholic scholars in conversation. That was the ideal. So he was trying to orient things in that way. Dick McCormick, a Roman Catholic, who was a close friend of his, was sort of the leader along with Leroy. So Leroy's the Protestant. Andre is Dick McCormick is the Catholic scholar. And then they brought in a couple of Jewish scholars and a Muslim scholar. And so in the early days, that's who was sitting around the table. Then Leon Cass, of course, who was Jewish, was brought in, and Roy Branson, who was a rather different breed of Protestant, was brought in. Then Tris Engelhardt was brought in. Nobody was clear what Tris Engelhardt was, but somehow he seemed like the right person to hire at the time. And so and Tris, of course, was a philosopher. So those were the people sitting around the table in the early years.
So 1974 was a very big year.
We had a conversation, I think it may have been in 1975, maybe even late 1974, early, with Dan Clauser, who was at Hershey, another philosopher, but one who had separated himself from a philosophy department, left Dartmouth and went to Penn State at Hershey. So Clauser and his group came down, and so we're all citizens of the Kennedy Institute, we're all sitting around, and the conversation went something like this: well, what are you guys doing? And they said, well, what are you guys doing? There was no bioethics organization. Nobody knew what anybody was doing. We didn't know what was going on at Case Western Reserve at all, even though it had been going on actually longer than either of us, a little bit longer than either of us. There was just no way to transmit bioethics knowledge, and there was very little that was published by people like us. That's what makes the early days sort of interesting. Bob Veitch, who did not come to us then, but later, Bob Veitch had probably published more than anybody else. But even though Bob, like me, finished in 1970, but the transmission of the information still took some time to get out in publications. There hardly were any bioethics journals at the time. Leroy, in fact, to give you some idea about how late it was, Leroy and I proceeded to teach a course in 1976, I think it was, and we tried to do a comprehensive survey of all the literature that we would consider teaching to students, 1976, and we found 9 articles. 9 articles, and then, of course, there was Ramsey's Patient as Person and Fletcher's book. I don't think we would teach Fletcher's book, but that's how primitive the transmission of information and the available information was, which I think people don't really understand now that we have thousands and thousands of articles, sometimes thousands of articles on a single subject in bioethics.
So 72, Jeanne Heller writes about Tuskegee, tipped
Yes.
off by Peter Buxton.
Yeah.
The government has to do something to show that they're taking it seriously. The National Commission's formed in 74.
Don't forget the ad hoc panel.
The ad hoc panel.
Yeah, because the ad hoc panel is formed, and that's another major influence on me, beginning about that period of time, and then really almost to the point of his death, which is Jay Katz. You and I personally have talked about Jay Katz in the past. So Jay was a huge influence on many of us in the early days.
Well, let's start there then.
Yeah.
Talk to me about how it was you came to meet Jay. I assume it was at Yale, and your experience.
Actually wasn't.
Oh, sorry. Please
No.
talk to me about Jay.
Had I know about him, I used to hang out with people at the law school. I knew a lot of the law school students. Didn't really know the law school faculty because I wasn't a student there. As you know, I got appointed to the National Commission to be on the staff. And the way I got to know Jay Katz is he would call me on the phone because he knew somehow about my interest in autonomy. And he was keenly interested in autonomy. Remember in his 1984 book, which he's probably already working on at that point, I think 3 of the 8 chapters bear the word autonomy. Remember, autonomy was a word that was only coming in at that time. It had, despite what people say about Kant and the like, it did not have a long history of being around. But Jay adopted it early, and he knew that we were working with the National Commission and had sort of been assigned to me to do that work. So he would call me on the phone about what are the commissioners thinking, what's the staff doing, how are things going with autonomy, and so on. He had that kind of inquisitive mind, and that's actually how I got to know Jay.
And if you would, share a few memories of your interest in or experience with the Ad Hoc Commission.
With the panel?
Yes, the panel.
Really nothing except reading it when it came out, because we had to do that. There were certain things that were gospel at the commission that you had to read. One was the book that Jay had done in 1970 with Alex Caper and also Eleanor Swift Glass. That was when I came to the National Commission, Michael Yesley, the director, put that book on my desk and said, read it. This is the one thing you have to know. I'm not kidding. That's exactly what happened. So there were these things that we had to know. The ad hoc panel was obviously mandatory reading, and Katz's dissent, or however you want to categorize it, was particularly interesting reading in that document. But the whole document, of course, was setting the framework for what we had to think about. Now, interestingly enough, we didn't discuss Tuskegee very much in the National Commission, but what's important to know is that all the issues had been laid out by the Kennedy hearings, which was about the earliest time known to me where quite a number of people in bioethics were assembled to give testimony before Congress. It may have even been the first. Ask Charlie McCarthy. Charlie would know, right? Those events, the so-called Kennedy hearings on experimentation, which was actually a Senate subcommittee, together with the ad hoc panel report, was critical to the way in which the National Commission got started, and it carried with us all the way through. Even if we didn't talk about the Kennedy hearings or the ad hoc panel, it was the big background event, the stage setting, so to say.
So the commission has a very broad mandate. It includes studying groups like fetuses and prisoners, but also looking at ways to protect subjects and to ensure their welfare and to come up with a system.
Mandate, yes.
Very broad mandate. Please walk us through how the commissioners, and under Ken Ryan's leadership, approached that work. And was it serial priorities? Was it subcommittees among the commissioners? Talk to me as a member of that staff. You were there.
Yeah.
How it all came to be.
The living person, the one still living, that you may want to ask that question to is Michael Yesley, because the basic answer to your question is Michael Yesley and Ken Ryan would sit down to it. They got along very well. which wasn't necessarily true with either of them, didn't necessarily get along with other people. They really got along well between them, and they were very good leaders. Michael was a good leader of the staff. Ryan was a good leader of the commission, which is a bunch of independent, very independently minded people, but he managed to keep it in tow. And they're really the people who would know what kind of decisions were made about what gets priority, what's going to be on the agenda next time. And then they would take it and dump it pretty much in the lap of Barbara Michigan and say, these were our ideas about the next meeting. Implement it. Right? Barbara was the associate director, so Barbara would then come to the rest of us and say, here's what we've got to do for the next. That was the process, so to speak. Now, it was quite clear in certain cases what had to be done. For example, the first thing the commission had to address was research involving the fetus because they were mandated. There was no option. And then there were certain other things that were unavoidable. For example, as you know, my staff assignment was to write up the ideas for the Belmont Report, to write the Belmont Report, except for the boundaries section, which Bob Levine had pretty much taken care of by the time I started on the Belmont Report. So there were staff assignments that were made that way, sometimes largely in accordance with professional fields. Belmont actually came fairly late in the thought there was, let's get under our toe what we think about all these other things before we begin to report to the public what it is that we did and what principles we used. Let's figure it out. So a lot of the early reports, which came in sequence, oriented around the idea of vulnerable populations, basically, began to flow. And the most important one, I believe, by far, was the report on children. It was the most carefully reasoned, it was the most thoroughly discussed, and it was, in fact, the best document that we produced as a report. It was really, I think, an excellent report, whereas the report on prisoners was, I wish we could do it again, kind of thing. So we went through these reports. With the children's report, we argued for a year about the stuff. The report's about that thick, so it's a fair amount of writing. But we argued for a year in the commission over the issues, and actually had 2 dissents. And so you might say, how could that be your best report if you've got 2 dissents? They were profoundly difficult issues. And it was amazing that we only had 2 dissents, given how difficult the issues were. Pediatricians thought we were crazy, right, when we were forming these ideas about ascent of a child of 7 years old or more. I mean, that was considered just ridiculous. So we had to work through a lot of stuff like that. But in the end, that really was our best document. And when I wrote Belmont, I kept going back to the children's report for the kind of language and arguments and so on that we had used there.
There are some long-standing controversies that I've always wanted to ask someone who was there, who was involved with Belmont about. And among them was the suspicion, however cynical, that Congress wasn't really that interested in ethics or bioethics or subject protections. This was all post-Tuskegee window dressing. And I'd like your opinion, as someone who really was involved real time, as to whether that cynical, this was all for show suggestion rings true.
I can't tell you for all of Congress. I couldn't even come close. Again, Charlie McCarthy would know more about that. I mean, Charlie would say, I know more about the inside of the commission, but he certainly knew more about the politics and the congressional figures than I do. I will say this, I do believe that Senator Edward Kennedy, Senator Jack Javits, and Senator Walter Mondale were most serious and very, very committed. Now, they may have had more than one reason for this. Could have been a play to constituents and so on. But no, I think they had very serious ethical reasons for being involved, and very serious concerns about vulnerable populations. And of course, they were the architects of much of what happened.
So another...
Tuskegee helped.
Yes.
Right, that's true. But I don't think it's just Tuskegee window dressing.
Another enduring, shall we say, controversy is the genesis of the inclusion of the social and behavioral issues, the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects in Biomedical and Behavioral Research.
Yes.
And some felt that that was a near direct outgrowth of Stanley Milgram's research and the outcry that had resulted, and others felt that the commissioners had really not focused on Milgram, but had many other reasons for including behavioral. And I wonder if you might speak to that, please.
I can't speak to why it was called the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. I don't know. The biomedical part I get very well, and I actually like the language of biomedical. Some people just like bioethics these days. I actually prefer that language myself. Behavioral, I think, did get swept in because there were a number of controversies about things that behavioral scientists had done. Milgram among them, but there were other controversies. So one of the things that you learned that were available to us in the way of literature at the time were case studies, or something like mini case studies. And there were, just as there were biomedical research horrors, frankly, Nuremberg wasn't taken all that seriously, which is another story. But it was considered eccentric, not something that we were subject to in civilized Western nations, right? So it didn't figure in a big way. So Tuskegee loomed really large, and then there were the vulnerable subjects questions, and then there were these various case studies in the behavioral sciences. So I have to think that the reason they got swept in is because there was an interest in these cases, like the Milgram case, and they were all research, right? So they got lumped, for better or for worse. I think in certain respects, for worse, that they got lumped. And one of the outcomes of this, which I know you would know a great deal about, is behavioral scientists never felt, including Brad Gray on the staff of the National Commission, never felt that they got a fair hearing for the behavioral issues and the differences between the behavioral and the biomedical, often described in our commission as social sciences, not behavioral sciences, but whatever, social sciences, behavioral sciences, both. They never thought they got a fair hearing in the commission or a good outcome when it came to the regulation of research. And I think there's a good bit to be said for that.
I'm very interested in who wrote the Bible. And in our field, it's who wrote the Belmont Report.
Right.
And I know you are widely credited as the primary author, but I'd like to hear more about the genesis and how the writing assignments were divided and how it all came to be, this document we hold so dear and that has been so incredibly enduring.
Yeah, there have been a number of discussions of the history of Belmont. I actually think it's pretty simple. So I'll tell the story as I know it. First of all, it's a commission document, and that's very important to bear in mind. There's nobody's name on the document that says X or X, Y, and Z wrote it. And it is most definitely a commission document, and I'll explain what the process was for that attribution. There was, first of all, the Belmont Retreat. I was not at the Belmont Retreat because I hadn't yet joined the staff. And it's quite clear that a number of people made significant contributions to the discussion there. Karen Labax, who was a commissioner, is clearly one. Charles Freed, who was a visitor, was one. I won't go on. The commissioners were pretty much all there, and the staff, such as it was at the time, was all there, and they engaged in this discussion. And it was actually decided at that time what the three principles were, right? Respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. For better or for worse, it was decided at that time. But there was no analysis of the principles. There was the discussion about why these three principles and whether they would do the work that needed to be done. Now, at the time, the work that needed to be done, in part, was to have principles so that the commissioners could talk to one another. You might say, that's ridiculous. Why don't you just talk? But there were There were professional background difficulties. To mention just one, Joe Brady was a behaviorist psychologist. And the idea of the kind of normative language that was being used and some of the psychological language that was being used, he didn't understand it. It had to be more or less translated to him as to what was meant. And then finally he'd say, oh, you mean so-and-so. And then he would express it in his behaviorist psychology language. And we would go on. So you had blocks like that, blocks between the lawyers and the philosophers. And we had two people in religious ethics who were on the commission and so on. So that had to be overcome, and it clearly was not overcome completely at the Belmont Retreat. But things got sort of solidified there. Basically, we knew, well, you got to be careful about this too, that you don't rewrite history. We knew there had to be the principles because that was mandated by the legislation, and we knew there had to be a discussion of the boundaries between research and practice because that was part of the legislation. So by the end of the Belmont Retreat, it was known what the group thought the principles would be, and that never went away, actually, in title and name. And we knew that there had to be something on boundaries, but boundaries was not principles. So you got, so to speak, a division, and you could see that in the final product of the Belmont Report. That actually is the direct legacy of Congress. Congress mandated, basically, that the National Commission would decide about matters of boundaries and would decide about matters of the principles. Now, the reason they wanted, you might say, why do you need boundaries? Why don't you just have principles? Because it's supposed to be an ethics document, and these are the moral principles. What does boundaries have to do with it? And the explanation of that is also, I think, fairly simple and very interesting. This was a political decision to have a boundaries section. Why? Because you could regulate research, and it seemed apparent that there was going to have to be regulation because of the history of scandals, whether you go all the way back to Nuremberg, which I don't think is really quite the proper dating, or you just take these more immediate scandals like Tuskegee. There was a general conviction that science, meaning research, had to be regulated, right? But practice, right? Now you're talking something that's really politically sensitive, and it was never in question, so far as Congress was concerned, that practice would be regulated. So you had to draw the boundaries. Why did you have to draw the boundaries? Because you have to know what you're going to regulate, right? You can't regulate practice, so you have to know what it is that you're regulating, namely what research is. So that's the background of it. Anyway, this is mandated more or less by the Congress that the National Commission proceed in this way, and it did. It was faithful to the congressional mandate. So I get appointed by to the staff, and then I get designated by Michael Yesley, the director, as the person in charge of the Belmont document. He says, got to have a section on boundaries. At that time, envisaged as a late section. It later got put first, largely by a decision of Ken Ryan, if I'm remembering correctly. In any event, I'm to concentrate principally on the principles because there had already been a fairly aggressive and active discussion on boundaries, and a lot of that was reasonably well settled. I just had to be sure it would fit in with the rest of what I write about principles. And so I remember a discussion I had in front of the men's room on West Bard Avenue in a hallway, and we were talking about what are these principles? What do these principles mean, these principles coming out of Belmont? And Yesley said to me, well, Tom, I think that's pretty much up for you to tell us what they mean. That's your job. Right? So then he said something like, there's a file that we've assembled. I think he meant Barbara Mishkin had assembled. There's a file we've assembled of all the past discussions and materials on Belmont, and we'll give you that file. And he said, but I don't think you're going to find a lot in it that's going to answer your questions about principles. Right? So he gives me this file of 50 pages, and maybe it were simple. Somebody like Al Johnson might say I'm oversimplifying here, but this is my lasting impression. The boundaries section, which had been originally crafted for the commission by Bob Levine, but then highly stylized and simplified and condensed down to about 4 pages, was in great shape. This commission had spent a lot of time deliberating on it. Bob had written and rewritten and so on. That was really good. So that's 4 of the 50 pages I was given. The other 46 pages have virtually nothing to do with principles. It was stuff like copies of the Nuremberg Code, copies of the legislation that created the commission. It was, stuff like that. So over the course of the next 6 months, as we had meetings every month, the National Commission. So over the course of the next 6 months, I got rid of all the other 46 pages. They were all gone. That's documentable, by the way, because we have on record each of the month's books, and you can see the pages progressively disappearing from the copies of what was given to the commissioners as the materials on the Belmont Report. So I wrote all this stuff about principles. And you might say, okay, so then you're the author of everything except the boundaries section, which was Bob Levine as then discussed by the commission and reduced down. Well, yes, but the thing not to forget is what I mentioned at the beginning. This is a commission document. And so it's a process. It was not just me writing it and the commission saying, oh, that's good. It wasn't like that at all. I would write something, and we would go in and discuss it, and then it would get the stuffing knocked out of it. I'll give you an example of this. Commissioner Donald Selden, who became a very close friend of mine, wanted a very philosophical piece of work. So he wanted there to be a mention of the importance of people like Immanuel Kant and why that would be important for respect for persons, and John Stuart Mill, and why that would be important for the principle of beneficence. But he's absolutely right about this. So I wrote up various things sort of like this to sort of satisfy Selden, and then it goes to the National Commission. They say, what's all this stuff from Kant and Mill? And so we don't want that. This is a public document that enunciates principles that everybody can read. So, that stuff's all gone. So this is not my determination. First of all, that Mill or Kant went in the first place. That was the request of a commissioner. And then when it flew out, that was the request of the other commissioners. So the document really has to be understood as written in that form. You had to be responsive to the commissioners. Moreover, they didn't always come directly to me. They would often go to Barbara Michigan because Barbara had served, so to speak, as the spokesperson in the past. She was on their Rolodex. We literally all had Rolodexes in those days. She's on their Rolodex, and they would call Barbara, and then Barbara would say, here's what Commissioner so-and-so wants. Here's what Pat King called me. Pat was my colleague and friend, right? So we called Barbara because Barbara's on the Rolodex. And Pat would give certain suggestions, and then Barbara would pass those along to me. That's really how the document was written. So in the end, when it said it is the document of the...
Yes, very much. I know that you've had an evolution in your thinking on at least a few of the issues in Belmont, and
Yes.
most notably since the stimulus funds and you're working on a project with the group at Hopkins, you've had an
Yes.
evolution in your thinking on the boundary between research and practice. And I wonder if you'd share that journey with us. And if you were rewriting
Yeah.
that section of Belmont, what would you say?
I think I was completely convinced at the time of the discussions with the National Commission. And bear in mind, Michael Yesley had given me, so to speak, final staff authority for the preparation of the Belmont Report as it went to the commissioners. So if there's something in there that's wrong, it's my fault, as it were. So when I say I was completely convinced about the boundaries section, I thought it was very solid work. And I not only believed it at the time, but I believed it for many years thereafter, as I worked on the research practice distinction. And I think I thought that the people before Belmont, and there were a number, who would write on the subject of research and practice and who would make them closely connected, what I now think of as an integration model of the relationship between research and practice rather than a segregation model. I thought this was just weak thinking. It was just weak thinking before we came along with the National Commission, that we sort of figured out what the real boundaries were. And it is true, I think the National Commission was the first to think very, very seriously about how to delineate the boundaries. I think that's fair to say. On the other hand, as Ruth and I, in particular, began to discuss these problems at a certain point, I'm not sure exactly what the certain point was, but it's been within the last decade, so you've got at least a 25-year elapse between the National Commission and our rethinking. Ruth Faden, my wife, right? We began to think that as changes were being made in modern clinical settings, advanced clinical settings in major institutions, and also in the practice of research of various sorts, this didn't seem to work all that well. This, what I think I initiated the term in our project of a segregation model versus an integration model. The segregation model too much segregated them. It kept research too far from practice. So one of the first things that we were doing, and I say we because I didn't sit at my desk and think, it was mostly through discussion with people like Ruth and Nancy Cass, and then eventually Peter Pronovost and Stephen Goodman and Sean Tunis were all sitting around the table. We batted this around for 2 years. And of course, there was then, I think, a steep evolution in all of our thinking. And we came to think this bifurcation model, this segregation model, is not the right way to think about these issues at all, and certainly not the right way to think about oversight mechanisms. What kind of oversight should be introduced into the system? So we really began to rethink the thing from the foundations up. To go back to your original question, what I now think is what the National Commission came up with may have been a very good document for the time to figure out what the boundaries were and to bring at least one domain, the research domain, under an oversight system that was a reasonably good oversight system. And I think there have been a lot of people, very good people in bioethics who've been involved in that over the years, that is, say, the oversight and regulation and so on. But our thought is it's time to rethink that system and to talk a lot more about the integration between research and practice, especially in an era in which we're looking to what the Institute of Medicine calls learning healthcare systems, in which there'll be an extremely rapid delivery of information, sometimes from internally within an institution, but potentially from every institution in the world. Every country will be feeding data into a database. The model that we worked with early on was pediatric cancer, because pediatric cancer has gotten so much feedback, so much transmission of information, such a rapid development in a difficult area over the years. Imagine that being accelerated in virtually every institution where you get immediate feedback of information about what's working and what's not working in Buenos Aires, in Tokyo, in every country in Europe and so on, being fed into our institutions. We think it's really going to change the picture, and that it really no longer will be sensible in the way which it has been sensible to talk about a segregation of research and practice. Now, that's going to take a long time, and of course it's going to occur mostly at the beginning in healthcare institutions that dispense healthcare, but that need information in order to improve the care. Oh, it's already happening with places like Geisinger, to some extent, Intermountain, and so on. This will rapidly accelerate, so we believe. But it's an evolutionary process. We do not have a single learning healthcare system in the sense in which a learning healthcare system is envisaged as a core. We have no pure, so to speak, learning healthcare system, but we will, right? There's going to be an evolutionary process. Then you have a lot of people who now are outside of the domain of what we're talking about as integration. Right now, anyway, something like pharmaceutical clinical trials really are segregated for the most part. Even there, you have to make distinctions. So it'll be a long time before everything becomes into an integrated system. But we think that the time has come to rethink both the boundaries of research and practice, the nature of research and practice, and certainly the oversight systems. Now, one of the things that underlies our change of thinking goes back to what I said earlier about the National Commission and the Congress being willing to regulate research but not willing to regulate clinical medicine. One of the major things that we think you have to rethink is what an oversight system should be for clinical medicine. And here's why, and I think this is very interesting from a primer perspective. The view has long been that research is risky, but practice is a matter of accepted therapy in which the best interest of the patient is at hand, so it doesn't need something like oversight systems. We think the evidence is mounting at the present time to indicate that assumption is false. That is to say, if you had to choose between what's the riskier domain, if you want to put it in terms of boundaries and domains, it's probably riskier in clinical medicine than it is in research, in which case the system makes no sense. What you would want in the way of an oversight system is protection against risk, not protection against researchers who do bad things with you. So you have to rethink the whole system in that regard. So that's sort of the evolution of my thinking, greatly assisted by my colleagues that I mentioned earlier.
So I'd like to go back to the first principle, respect for persons, and ask whether you've had further thinking on that principle, and if so, what revisions or deletions you'd make.
Well, I proposed with the National Commission when I was doing drafts, and I emphasize drafts of Belmont, that, and I actually got in one draft, the idea that it shouldn't be respect for persons at all, but should be respect for autonomy. The reason for that is my inherent suspicion about the word persons, because I don't think anybody knows what it means. So if you say you've got respect for persons, as a philosopher, I thought you were obligated to say what it is that you have respect for. That is to say, what do you understand a person to be? And it was quite clear that the Commission was not interested in doing that, but it was also quite clear, more or less by the dictate of Ken Ryan, after we discussed this for this idea that I had for a while, that we're not going further. We had already committed ourselves to respect for persons, and this stuff about the distinction between respect for persons and respect for autonomy was only going to get us into trouble. All right, that was Ken's determination, so that's how it, so to speak, got resolved. I think that was a mistake. I thought it was a mistake at the time because I thought the principle that you could really articulate with some depth would be respect for autonomy. Respect for persons you couldn't, and moreover, it made a muddle out of things because when you were talking about respect for non-autonomous persons, which we did, no problem, right? Basically, the principle that was being invoked as to what you were respecting, what you were obligated to do was the principle of beneficence. So there's a confusion then between these two principles. Suddenly, respect for persons gets turned into beneficence, or to put it another way, you're relying on the principle of beneficence to give moral weight to what you want to do with non-autonomous persons. It was not until after the Commission shut down and I got involved, and I forget what project it was, that I began to rethink what was really going on in those discussions when I was arguing for respect for autonomy and the Commission was arguing for respect for persons. And the conclusion that I came to is the principle of respect for persons is not so much a moral principle per se as it is, to use today's language, a statement of moral status. What the Commission really wanted to say is, it doesn't matter whether you're autonomous or you're non-autonomous, you're still owed respect because you have moral status. That's really what they wanted to say. But nobody came up with that at the time. And in retrospect, I think that's what we should have said. The principle of respect for persons starts out with an assumption that all persons, by virtue of being persons, are owed respect because they have moral status, or all persons have moral status, something like that. They were trying to ensure that that's the case, and that's basically what's going on in principle. It would have been a lot clearer and more direct, I think, had we not done that, which is basically what Jim Childers and I later did in the Principles of Biomedical Ethics, was to turn it around in that fashion. Nonetheless, that's the way Belmont reads, and that's the way I think Belmont will always read. I don't think there will ever be a revision of the Belmont Report.
This might then be moot, but given the volume and expanding volume of research done in resource-scarce countries, how do you see Belmont as informing or not research in, again, countries that don't have either the infrastructure or certainly the ethical canon that we have?
That raises all sorts of issues. Number one, if they don't have the proper infrastructure, there are two kinds of infrastructure that maybe are at stake here. One is the infrastructure to do the research, and the other is the infrastructure of things like review committees that would be able to process principles like those in Belmont and really put them at work in their community. Should either of those not be the case, I have my doubts that we should be doing research in those countries. However, I think a lot of countries either do have that infrastructure, or if you go into the country to do a certain kind of research, let's say pharmaceutical companies in particular, because they've got a lot of resources that they can throw at, they can build the infrastructure for the scientific research. Harder to build the ethics infrastructure. You need something already there that's pre-existing. They could build the scientific side of the infrastructure. And I think, in fact, that's one of the major questions about where should pharmaceutical companies do their research. It's not so much the question of whether there's a scientific infrastructure in the country. It's really a question about whether there's the ethics infrastructure so that people will be treated in the right way, in an ethically appropriate way, and it would realistically, you would get decisions that would follow something like the Belmont principles. Now, then the question about community engagement arises. I'm a big proponent of community engagement, but then what I think of as the problem of cultural relativism arises as well. So you say, well, you can't really instantiate the Belmont principle of respect for persons because, as Belmont says, that corresponds with informed consent, and informed consent is to be taken seriously as individual informed consent. And my view there is not to compromise on this point. If you can't get individual informed consent, then I don't think you probably should be doing research in that setting or in that community. Now, there is the community engagement side. You could have discussions with, and I think you should pretty much in all cases, where you go into what you're talking about. Research poor, was that your language?
Scarce.
Resource scarce, yeah. Under-resourced or whatever countries. It is very important to do that. But you also may walk away from those discussions and think we shouldn't be doing research here. We can't get appropriate moral decisions being made. And I myself am pretty non-compromising on the consent question.
I can't imagine that there are many people in life who have as many magnum opuses, or whatever the plural is, as you. But I'd like to just ask you about what has equaled the drafting of Belmont and the serving as staff to the commission in your life as it relates to research ethics and IRBs. And then I'd like to talk about the federal regulations, but I'd like to just hear you talk to me about what other high-impact projects you've worked on that we might at least touch on before we have to close today.
Well, there are two things, I think, and they're very different in the kind of answers that I would give. One is the Principles of Biomedical Ethics, which I wrote with Jim Childers, and was writing at exactly the time I was writing Belmont. So I would be drafting Belmont during the day, and then I would either go home or go to the office and meet Jim at night and write part of the Principles of Biomedical Ethics. Somehow people have thought, a number of commentators have thought the one was written before the other or something, but they are actually written directly simultaneously. And as you can imagine, I was learning from the one context to the other. A simple example of that is Childers and I have been operating largely on a clinical ethics model, because that's where most of the issues were that were discussed at the time. So I'm seeing all this stuff in the National Commission, and I'm saying, whoa, research ethics is at least as important as clinical ethics. And so we began to incorporate a lot of what I was learning there back into the drafting of the principles of biomedical ethics. But the real story, I think, about principles of biomedical ethics is that it has taken me and Jim 7 editions to sort of get the landscape mapped out in the way in which we really think it should be mapped out. And I don't know that we've really still gotten it exactly the way it should be. And that, in part, is because of all of the changes and the maturation, I think, really that's occurred in bioethics more generally. So we had to keep up what was going on in the field and revise our book in that light. And in, say, maybe the second edition, that wasn't so difficult because the material was still very sparse. There wasn't that much material. We're doing the second edition before the presidential commission from 1980 to 1983 has completed its work and has its volumes out. So it wasn't that difficult in the early years, but then in the later years, this enormous amount of work is done in bioethics that we have to accommodate, but that's to our advantage. It's a huge amount of work to actually make a revision. Sometimes people think when you do a revised edition of a work, you slap a few sentences here and there and you add a section to a chapter maybe, and that's it. That's really not what happened. We had to continue, the book continued to evolve as the field would continue to evolve. And someone like John Ayres would accuse us, this was in good humor, but John would say, you're the great Borg. You're assimilating all this knowledge and then incorporating it within your system. And I've said to John, to a certain extent, that was true. We were learning what everybody else was doing. But in any event, that of course, has been a huge project, a 35-year project, really, for me and Jim. The other was the book that Ruth and I did on a history and theory of informed consent. But it was actually done with 2 other people, one of whom is acknowledged on the title page, and that's Nancy King. But the other was Bettina Schoene-Seifert, a German physician of some notoriety in European bioethics, but I think probably no longer, anyway, a major player on the American scene. But Bettina was in there very early, and she's very, very smart. And so what happened was Ruth and I hired the 2 of them as research assistants, not knowing how good they were. Actually, I think we were probably originally just envisaged them as research assistants. So Bettina's a physician. I'm a philosopher. Nancy's a lawyer. And Ruth comes from public health and health psychology. So we got major disciplinary differences. And why this was so important to me is I learned from the year and a half or so when all 4 of us sat around a conference table, and sometimes it was our dining room in our house, and debated these issues about informed consent. I don't know if you know what the literature was like at the time, but there were just a few what I would call first-rate contributors, one of whom was, of course, Jay Katz. And we debate their ideas and all of the stuff that had happened in law. And we came to realize all the deficiencies of law because these are really moral issues, not really constrained in the way in which the legal thinking was constrained. The bottom line point I want to make is I think I, like most philosophers, let's just say many philosophers, were pretty naive about what real multidisciplinary research was like, where you really had to accommodate the thought of people in other fields. Now, I'd had a certain significant exposure to that with the National Commission as part of it, no question, because we had multiple disciplines and we had to work through things in this way. But I think this was the first time I really came to see how multidisciplinary research should operate in a very creative way in which you pay no attention to disciplines. You just take the issues
and then you begin to attack them from your perspectives and work through them. That was hugely important to me in my own development, because I never left the multidisciplinary thing behind after that. It was even hard for me to think through ethical issues just as a philosopher, which is I think what most philosophers do. They're trained as philosophers. They think through it in that way. I think through ethical issues in terms of what are people from law and people from the sciences and so on going to think around this. So it was a sort of life-transforming experience. But again, I would have to say it was both the National Commission and the writing of the History and Theory of Informed Consent.
So if I was the chair of an IRB or the director of an IRB or HRPP, I would not want Tom Beauchamp on my IRB, because I would be intimidated and I would be afraid that he would be, bleeding red ink all over every protocol. So have you ever served on an IRB, Tom Beauchamp?
Yeah, then I was on the Georgetown IRB. Honestly, it was not a good experience, but I'll tell you why. And I think it's something that you've heard many times before. The IRB was comprised of I was young at the time, pretty young. They were all senior physicians at the medical school, all male, and me and a young nurse in the nursing school. And basically what happened is these guys knew the sciences very well. They didn't know anything about ethics. But it's supposed to be ethics review. So they had what they called a subcommittee. And the subcommittee, all the meetings started off with the subcommittee reporting. And the subcommittee was called the Subcommittee on Scientific Validity or something like that. And the principle was we shouldn't proceed to discuss the ethics of this or to approve it without knowing whether it's scientifically sound or not. So the subcommittee would always report first, and then there would be general discussion. That was the format. The problem was they all got completely wrapped up in scientific validity questions, which were basically, how good is the science? So should it proceed? So so let's say 25 minutes was allocated for the discussion of this protocol. The first 20 minutes would be on this question of scientific validity. Really, is how good was the science? So then there's 5 minutes left for the ethics discussion. And that was usually me and the nurse raising what we saw as the ethical issues. And we were often met with rather stupefied looks. Like, really? You think we should take that seriously? All they're doing is asking pregnant women a few questions. What is the problem, right? And after 3 years of this, I kind of got tired of it. So I don't think I was very effective on that committee because of the context. I'll tell you, though, another experience that I had, this is one of my favorite experiences, actually, in my history, and I think it's directly pertinent to your question, even though it's not an IRB. I was asked by a committee of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration to be on what they called a panel. And the question was, can we send monkeys up in space to do experimentation? And there were a couple of problems. One, not such nice things happen to the monkeys, and of course they're completely bewildered about where they are. And so there have been a lot of complaints from animal advocate groups to Congress. Congress was sending a lot of material down asking for answers about whether they really had to have this program, and so on. So a number of things like that were happening, but they also had a certain death rate of the monkeys. So the assignment that we were given is, can we send chimps, it was rhesus macaques, can we send them up, and what's the problem with this? Can we continue with the program? So the panel is called on to meet. We've never met one another. We all come around. There are 8 of us on the panel. We come around the table. And we're basically to function, I think, like an IRB. We're supposed to deliberate. It's basically a protocol, right? Sending rhesus macaques into space. So we come into the meeting room, and I'm not kidding. You know, whatever the staff was at NASA, of course, they don't have anybody in ethics. So we come in, and there's a stack of papers about this high on the left, and that's the science, right? Because we're supposed to look at the quality of the science and the importance of the science as well. And on the right was one sheet of paper, and that was the ethics, right? It speaks volumes, right? So then there was no other ethicist but me. There was a chaplain, and I think the chaplain wondered why he had been appointed as well. But I think it was their idea of having an ethicist. And it was me. So I then began to discuss what the ethical issues were and how they had to be taken seriously. Just as the science had to be taken seriously, the ethics had to be taken seriously. And somewhat surprisingly to me, the chief veterinarian became very interested in this. He didn't say, just dismiss it or whatever, or treat it as only the science is important. He got actually very interested in this. And he said, yeah, we probably should pay more attention to this than we have. I could see some scientists around the table that were beginning to get concerned about it. But we actually had a good chair. The science chair was actually very good. Then the long and the short of what's a long story, but it's a very interesting story, they did take it seriously. And they were willing to initiate reforms. It eventually led to what's called the Sundowner Report, it was the direct outcome of what we did there. It got NIH, not just NASA, but NIH and bioethics involved in what they were doing, and the space flight. We're talking about $30 million, or which was a lot of money at that time. The space flights were shut down because next spaceflight reporting had 2 more deaths of the monkeys that they sent up, and they said that's now a 16.67 fatality rate of the monkeys. And interestingly enough, this is a great story, but I won't tell it to you because it's a long story. The Americans and the Russians and the French, who were the sponsors of the research, all said that's too high a death rate. It's not acceptable. And so the whole missions were shut. They've never again flown rhesus macaques into outer space. So what starts off looking pretty grim, right, winds up with something that's pretty good. That's my one success. That was my one success.
So many successes, and I did not think it possible for my admiration and the inspirational value I get from you each time I hear you to deepen, but it has. So thank you so much, Tom.
Thank you for doing the interview.
Oh,
my privilege.
My privilege.